Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So, welcome everybody again. I'm Eric. We've got Kristina and Renata here as well, and together we are the CCT Data Science, or part of the CCT Data Science team. Not all of it, but part of it. And this is the third part in a three-part series about ggplot2, sort of intermediate ggplot2 stuff. And today is looking at the wide world of ggplot2 extensions. So we are going to explore what these extensions are, how to find out about them, how to learn about them, what they do. And then we're going to kind of do like a little bit of a sampler for you and demonstrate some of our favorite ggplot2 extensions, including Patchwork, which is great for assembling multi-panel figures for publications, for example. ggAnimate, which you can use to create animated plots that look great in presentations. ggdist is a great package for visualizing uncertainty and distributions of data, which is really useful. It gives some very thoughtful alternatives to your simple error bars. And ggraph is a way of plotting network data with ggplot2, including things like phylogenies, dendrograms. Those are network data as well. So yeah. And like I said, again, this is like a showcase. If you want to go along, you can. If you get the monitor real estate, for example, and you want to have our slides up on one side and you've got RStudio open and our faces over here, like go for it. And there is a link in the chat that'll get you to these slides. And there's a little clipboard button in the corner so you can copy and paste things into RStudio if you wish to. But this is the packages, I think. This is a fairly extensive list of the packages that we're going to kind of use today and kind of what they're for.
Yeah, those are the main ones. I think there's a few more like sort of
sprinkled
extra
in
ones, support ones later on.
Yeah, so. Sprinkled in throughout the slides probably. But yeah, these are kind of the main ones. So let's start by kind of looking at what these extensions are. So extensions to ggplot2 come in a lot of flavors, and we kind of talked about how to categorize these or talk about how they exist. And so there's this sort of range from very simple ones that kind of add just one thing to very complex ones, some that are very totally transformative and allow you to do stuff that doesn't seem like it should be possible with ggplot2. But it's still using ggplot2 and creating ggplot2 objects that you can then modify in the usual ways. So here's just a few smattering of examples. So some of these extensions are very sort of general use and very modular. So we've got two extensions here, ggBswarm and ggthemes. So ggBswarm adds a geom bswarm. So you can add that to any plot as a layer. And it's kind of like geom_point, except instead of when points are overlapping, instead of plotting them on top of each other, it spreads them out horizontally and makes this bswarm plot. And here I'm combining it with theme economist from the ggthemes package, which adds a bunch of themes, including this one, which makes it look like a plot in the economist. And it also includes like some themes I probably wouldn't recommend. Like there's a theme Excel if you want your plot to look like Windows 95 version of Excel with the gray background. Go for it. You can do that. There are lots of extensions out there that do stuff like this, where they maybe add a geom, they maybe add some additional themes, some additional color scales, things like that. And you can kind of apply them to any plot. You'll also see extensions that provide these kind of all-in-one functions. So this is an example from the package ggstatsplot. And you'll notice that rather than starting this with ggplot, the ggplot function, right, which is what we've seen before, is every ggplot starts with ggplot and defining the aesthetics mappings with that AES helper. This starts with ggBetweenStats. And it doesn't have that aesthetics helper. Instead, we're giving it these three arguments. And so this is doing a whole bunch of stuff though, right? It is adding these annotations and these little bars indicating which groups are significantly different, and adding p-values and violin plots and jitter plots with transparency and box plots, and like it's doing all this stuff. But it is still producing a ggplot2 object. So I can still add to it with the plus operator scale y continuous, and I can use that to modify, the y-axis breaks and the title and stuff like that. Or I could add, theme to it to change the theme or change the color scale, right? So I can still interact with it like it's a ggplot2 object. So you'll see a lot of these that are sort of these all-in-one functions. And then there is a whole smattering of like really transformative extensions that are often very like field specific. So here we've got an example of gggenes, which is for plotting genomes. And we've got ggspectra here, which produces these plots of electromagnetic spectra. Yeah, so there's a whole world out there. And how do you find out about these things? So there is a ggplot2 extensions gallery, which I will open up right now. And I'll put this link in the chat also in case you want to browse along. So there are 134 registered extensions. So that's not even all the extensions. That's just the ones that are in this gallery here. There are others out there. And I can even like switch this and say, show me the ones that are not even on CRAN, that are just like experimental and on GitHub maybe. We can search through this, we can filter it, or we can just browse through it and just kind of see the huge variety of stuff. So ggraph we're going to see later for network data, ggtree for phylogenies, geom text path for creating curved text labels. That's cool. gggenomes, which is different than gggenes that I showed an example of. All kinds of interesting stuff in here. And here's another example of something that's very transformative, right? gganatogram allows you to plot the tissues and organs of mice and humans. I haven't played with this, but this is very cool that this exists. So this is one place to sort of just browse through. It's kind of fun to just, know what's out there. Just have kind of an idea of what's possible just browsing through this. There's also this link here is the awesome ggplot2 list. Now this is really just a list, but it is a pretty darn comprehensive list of people that you could follow on social media to get information about ggplot2, a whole bunch of R packages for doing all kinds of stuff. I just saw something, ggcorset. I have no idea what a corset plot is. So that would be interesting to check out. There's gggenes again. And this sort of like keeps going. We've got themes and aesthetics in a separate category. So these are all extensions that just add themes. There's a GG cyberpunk. Apparently for cyberpunk themes, there's all kinds of stuff in here. I see a Star Trek color palette. We've got all kinds of stuff for sort of presenting plots and composing plots. So this is probably where, yep, there's patchwork, but there's all sorts of other stuff related to that. Interactive plots, plotting network data, plotting spatial data. So much in this list. There's also the R graph gallery, which I think we've seen if you were here for part 2. This is a collection of sort of different types of plots. And some of these, once you've decided what kind of plot you want to make, let's say I want to make a parallelogram. Not all of these, but many of them will point you to some kind of extension if it's something that doesn't kind of work out of the box in ggplot2. So for example, here, if you want to make a parallelogram, you could use the ggally package, which is a good extension, and has a ggpairs function, which is kind of one of these sort of all-in-one functions. And you can click on one of these and you can get example code for how to do this. So here, ggpairs, right? So this is kind of one of these all-in-one things. And yeah, we have example code. And if all that fails and you can't find what you're trying to look for, you can often find things that aren't in those places just by kind of searching with ggplot2 as a keyword. And you might be able to find something that's not yet on one of those lists. So there is a ton of stuff out there. And because of the way ggplot2 works, you can very often combine those extensions with what you already know. So I'm going to start off our package demos, showing you guys a little bit about Patchwork. And feel free to interrupt me and ask any questions. So Patchwork allows you to compose multi-panel figures with ease. Few things to notice here on this multi-panel figure I've created. One is we've just got one legend for both of these panels. So they both share the same color legend that corresponds to species. So we don't need to duplicate that. We've just got one legend here. Another thing to notice is that stuff is lined up really well. So even though like this plot at the bottom, it doesn't have a y-axis label, and this one does, but they're lined up by actually the panel. The area that contains the data here is what's vertically what's aligned there, and the same with the other edge. So they're lined up really well. And then there's also these labels for this multi-panel figure. So there's an A, B, and C that you could reference in a figure caption. So these are the three example plots that we're going to see being put together in different ways. And I'll just show you briefly what they are over here in our studio. So plot one, we've got body mass on the x-axis and bill length on the y-axis, and color is species. Scatter plot there. This is our Palmer penguins or penguins data set we've used before as examples in the other two workshops in this series. Plot two is another scatter plot with this time depth versus bill length, colored by species. And then the third plot is a histogram that is of body mass and is faceted by island. So we've got our three different islands there. Yeah, so those are basically our three plots. So Patchwork lets you combine plots in this really simple way just by using these kind of math operators. So a plus symbol combines two plots in sort of a way that just kind of wraps them. And so you could set, a number of rows and columns and things like that. The vertical pipe, which is the key in between the enter and backspace, at least on my keyboard, that combines plots horizontally. And we've got a slash for combining plots vertically, think like division, right? And then we've got parentheses that we can use to nest operations. So it's kind of like we're doing math with these plots, right? To add them together, combine them. So here's an example. We've taken P1 and P2 and said, put those side by side with this vertical pipe. And then both of those things, because of the parentheses, together, put that on top of P3. So very kind of intuitively, we've arranged these plots into these three panels.
What would this look like without the parentheses? Would it just put P3 under only P2?
Let's find out. So, oh, I guess I got to load library Patchwork. Without Patchwork, it tells you, warning, I can't do math to these things. But with Patchwork loaded, we can. So P1 is next to P2 divided by P3. So there's some built-in order of operations that just like there is in algebra, that if you don't have your parentheses, then there's some kind of default priority of how it works. So that is doing the same thing, it looks like, as this, which that's fine.
Yeah.
It's not what I want in this case, but that's a fine thing to do.
Yeah.
So combining guides, right? So I mentioned that we only need one color legend. So we can combine identical guides. So we do that by adding this plot layout function that's part of Patchwork, and we can say guides equals collect. And so in this case, that works because these are identical and they do have to be identical. And what I mean by identical means identical name. So it has to be species with a lowercase s. If one of them had an uppercase s, one had a lowercase, they wouldn't get combined. Has to be the same colors, has to be the same levels in the same order, and has to be the same key glyph. So this thing here in the legend where we're displaying the colors as points because this is a scatter plot. If it was a line plot on one of these, then the key glyph would be a line. If it was like a density plot or some kind of area being filled with those colors, the legend would be like a rectangle with the color, and those wouldn't combine because they wouldn't be exactly identical. So in that case, you might have to do a little bit of finagling to get them to match up, change some things, or you could just like remove the legend from one of the plots, and then you don't have this nice kind of shortcut, but you can figure it out. So plot layout guides equals collect is really nice. And as of the most recent version of Patchwork, you can also combine identical axes. So with plot layout, we have guides equals collect and axes equals collect. And in this case, again, because these axes are identical label, identical breaks, identical range, they get combined. So this can be really useful for creating kind of like doing your own kind of manual faceting or small multiples where there's repeated information. In this particular example, it's like, maybe this was helpful, maybe not. Where I've found it really useful personally is stacking plots vertically that have the same like time axis. So if you have a time series, for example, and you want to show temperature and precipitation as two separate panels, and they share the same time range, that to me is a really nice way to use this so that you don't have that repeated time scale, and you can get those two pieces of information a little bit visually closer together to make it easier to sort of line those up and make comparisons and see, oh, this day that it rained a lot, it was also cooler, for example. Yeah. And this is also something like you can kind of do manually, right? On one of the plots, you could use the theme function to remove the axis title and the axis labels and the axis ticks. You can totally do that manually, but this is just like a nice shortcut that works well. So there are a lot more options for controlling layout. I'll put a link to the package website at the end, and there's lots of ways you can kind of control the layout by adding empty areas. You can do inset plots. You can adjust the relative widths and heights of plots. But just using these like plus operators is a very simple way to start. Yeah, I see a comment in the chat about 3 variables collected at the same time over 24 weeks. And yeah, just when you've got 3 variables or 4 variables, the more you have, every time you repeat that x-axis, you just have less and less space for your data ink. So last week we talked about maximizing data ink to non-data ink ratio. This is a great way to do that when it makes sense. Yeah. So next thing I just want to show is tags. So you can add tags to each panel with the plot annotation function. So we can kind of string these together. We could have plot layout here too, but this is just showing plot annotation. Tag levels. Here I've got uppercase A, but that could also be a lowercase a, or it could be a number or a Roman numeral, and it will extrapolate out from there. And there's a ability to add a prefix and a suffix to that if you want like a period after the tag label, or in this case, I put parentheses. So I have A and B here. So it takes care of that automatically for you. It also introduces this ampersand operator, which you can use instead of plus to modify all the elements of a multi-panel figure. So if this was just a plus here, and I did P1 plus P2 plus theme BW, this theme BW would only apply to P2, right? Because that's just sort of the normal way that you add a theme pre-built theme to apply is you just use the plus, right, and add it. So ampersand here makes this apply to both plots. I can change the color scale of both plots at the same time with an ampersand. I could even use this to add another layer to both of the plots potentially. Like I could use ampersand, geom smooth or something if I wanted to draw some best fit lines through these clouds on both plots. I could do that, which is kind of cool. And you can also use it to combine ggplot objects with base R plots, which is pretty cool. So if you have a plot that you've already got code for it in base R, you don't want to translate it to ggplot2, or it's some output of a package that gives you the plot in base R sort of plot, you can use this tilde to combine it. So this will automatically turn this into something that can be combined with ggplot objects. So this could be used with the base R plot function, or here I've used it with hist, but you can use it with a variety of things.
So you can't save out the base R plot as and just use the name?
They don't do that. Base R
no, they don't do that.
Doesn't.
I guess it's been sorry. It's been a long time.
You can't do that. Yeah,
for that.
Yeah. So in base R, if I assigned this to something, I think it would be it might return the data, or it might return nothing at all. But it doesn't return something that you can print and then show this plot again. And so that's part of. I think that's part of why you need to do something special here. So this turns it into a GROB, which is grid object is an acronym for that, I think. And so that is some object that ggplot understands, ggplot2 understands, and now you can combine them. So it's a shorthand for doing a whole bunch of steps that are complicated that again you could figure out how to do it on your own, but yeah, simplifies that. So that's it for GG Patchwork, or sorry, Patchwork, not GG Patchwork. That's it for Patchwork. There's a lot more in that package that I encourage you to check out. And we'll have a link to the package documentation at the end, or you can find it in the meantime. But I'll pass it over to Kristina for GG Animate.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, Patrick makes things way easier. I remember adding a lot of those A/B labels by hand to plots. It was a big thing. So okay, yeah. So the second package that we're going to demo that extends the functionality of ggplot is called GG Animate. And so this is a really fun package and can be really useful. Basically what it does is it takes kind of multiple plots from that you could make in ggplot and stitches them together into an animation or a video. You can actually save them out as GIFs. And it's a really nice visual way to just look at how data changes. And so I put here that it can be really helpful for showing trends across time or in spatial data. And there's probably a lot of other uses for this package that I myself am not familiar with. And I included on the slide a nice quote from Thomas Lynn Peterson, who's the main developer of GG Animate, here about basically a good rule of thumb for when, what you should transition across when you create these plots using GG Animate. So, okay, I think next slide. So yeah, we'll get into an example of this because it'll probably be easiest to understand in this case. Okay, so this is using the same penguins data set that we've been using for most of the examples throughout this series. And so this is showing just the distribution of body size of these penguins by species and then faceted by year. So looking at just the trends in body size distribution across years. And so this is a nice way to display that, or the faceting way is a nice way to display that, but you can also basically use GG Animate to put them kind of one on top of the other. And so if you watch, these lines are slowly moving, transitioning between the first year to the second year to the third year. And so this is another way you can see sort of the change in body mass across time. And so the the verbs that ggAnimate uses for this sort of thing are the transition verbs. Here I'm using transition time because this is a time series one. But there's a more general one called transition states that can also be used here to transition across different types of variables. And then also you can add in information about basically like what frame the animation is currently on. So that's how I added the year at the top there. And there's a few other things that you can add in using that sort of label. So yeah, this is like a cool way to look at this data in a more like animated way, I suppose. Okay, then next slide. And so there's like a bunch of other things you can kind of do to customize these plots. You can do kind of, I mean, some of them don't look super great here maybe, but like you can sort of imagine there are cases where this would be really helpful. So there are these shadow verbs. If you look at the last line of the code, there's a handful of these shadow verbs that basically display data that's not the data that's currently being displayed. And so in this case, it's showing basically the, a wake of the data as it's moving. It's showing the past data or past transition. I guess it's not technically data. It's showing the locations of the transitions that just happened. And so this is a nice way of showing the actual movement then of these lines from one year to the next. So yeah, that's another thing you can do with ggAnimate. Another thing you can do, and this is getting like into some of the nitty gritty, but is really interesting. They have some verbs, these ease verbs, and then also these enter and exit verbs. And basically what this does is it controls kind of like what the transition is doing. And a lot of it is about controlling the speed of the transition. So hopefully you can see here, maybe that what's happening between the frames is that it's changing slowly and then really fast and then slowly again. And so there's like a handful of different arguments you can use to like basically determine the sort of like mathematical shape of the change in time between these transitions. And so yeah, I just chose one of them, but there's a bunch. And then one of the last things that you can do using ggAnimate to customize these is you can basically affect what the range of the axes is being shown at any given time. And so this one's a little funky because especially the y-axis is kind of like the label's changing, so it looks a little funny. But what's going on here is that basically the graph is like shrinking or expanding to only include the data. So if you remember from before, like there was a bunch of space sometimes at the top of the plot because it was the smaller or the more spread out distributions. So there are a bunch of these view verbs that you can also use to sort of control basically what coordinates are being shown. Looks like there's a question.
This is also really nice, this view follow. I've seen it used really effectively for like exponential increases, right? Where you have at the beginning of your time series, small variations in the y-axis, and then it gets exponentially larger. And if you don't have that view follow, then you can't see the little details that are happening in the beginning because they're overwhelmed by the magnitude of the sort of exponential increase at the end. And so view follow is a great way to kind of show that exponential increase. It makes it really dramatic and also allows you to like see the data when it's at the beginning. Yeah, there's some questions in the chat. So Ujjal asked about saving plots and putting them in the PowerPoint, and we are going to get to saving them. You can save them as animated GIFs. And then Sarah got the error, no renderer backend detected. ggAnimate will default to writing frames to separate files.
You probably need to install something called GIFski on your computer. File writer. Okay, that's what I assume. Sorry, just like off the top of my head. So yeah, the default renderer for ggAnimate I think is called GIFski. And I have, when I've created these on the HPC, I actually had to have them install GIFski, but I think it was already on my computer, like personal computer.
Yeah, so there's some kind of like backend for creating the animated GIFs. And it sounds like if it doesn't have that, it's just going to save each frame as a separate file.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which would kind of like, there'd be no purpose in using ggAnimate for that, right?
And
I don't really know how
there's some documentation about this on the ggAnimate website, right?
Yeah, just on the very like first page, there's some information about this.
Yeah. And Brian has a, I think, maybe related error. File renderer failed to copy frames to the destination directory. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. Do you have to specify where the directory is? It might be that you need to be sort of need to be working in a working directory where you are allowed to
write out the files, because I think that is what it's doing in the background, is wherever you run this, it's saving all of the images in a folder somewhere, I would assume.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you don't have access.
Yeah, we can look into that.
Yeah, we can definitely you all troubleshoot these errors.
Cool.
Okay.
Oh, here's the
oh yeah. So I think when you run like create the animations in ggplot, I think it probably saves out some files to do that, but then you can actually save it as like one, one actual file. And so there's a few different like functions for doing this, but anim save is sort of the base one for just saving that out as, hopefully, if it works right, as one GIF, like one, basically, like, it's not actually a video, but they're similar, and just save that as one file on your computer. And then, yeah, as Eric mentioned earlier, you can like share that GIF with people, like they don't need RStudio or anything like that. You can probably, put it in presentations, send it to somebody on Slack or email it to them or something. You can do a lot with it at that point. So, or like what we did here, which is like embedded into Quarto, like presentations or Quarto websites or whatever. That's another option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as I remember, both PowerPoint and Keynote handle animated GIFs like correctly, and they do actually animate them in presentations. So I think it's a good way to go.
Yeah. And then I think I had a couple of like takeaways about GG Animate before we talk about the distribution package. So yeah, so you can customize a lot of stuff like like what I showed. Some of the verbs are a little confusing to like wrap your head around what they're doing, but I think that if you just read through the documentation, which isn't that long, you can sort of sort out, especially if you have a clear idea of what you want to do. And one thing that is not great about this for the people who've been trying to run the code is that the rendering is really slow. And so it can make it hard to sort of like, if you just want to like explore and try things out, it's like, okay, well, I want to look at this plot. I like run it, and then you have to sit there for like a minute or whatever to wait for it to actually render. So yeah, it's not great, but it's just one of the limitations. So yeah, that is GG Animate. And if anyone ever makes any cool animations with this, feel free to like share them with us. It'd be awesome to see.
Yeah.
And then I think I'm going to hand it over now to Renata to talk about our other two demo packages.
Yeah. Yeah, so the first one I was going to talk about is called ggdist, and it's for plotting distributions. And so either sort of like one-dimensional distributions like histograms or density plots, or like distributions around a line or a curve, which you see in ggplot, sort of base ggplot, and density plots or histograms or ribbon plots. But it adds a lot more flexibility, and it makes it a lot easier to generate sort of summarized plots of distributions without having to like create yourself extra data frames. And so it's really good for just like visualizing like distributions of values and samples, or for visualizing uncertainty in either frequentist or Bayesian model inputs or outputs. Next slide. So ggdist has like two major sort of like types of data it'll plot. And so for like one-dimensional distributional data, so where you would use a histogram or a density plot, it all revolves around this thing called a slab interval, which is plotting simultaneously a like density distribution and that line of varying widths or varying thicknesses. And those thicknesses correspond to like 50%, I think 90%, no, 50% and then 90%. No, it's the median, and then I think 90%, and then 99% or 95% of the data. And you can customize the widths there. And that stat slab interval, you don't have to compute any of those statistics or generate the density smooth before you feed the data in. You can just give it the raw data and it'll do everything else. Next slide. So there are then variations on that kind of X interval, like sort of fill in the blank interval plot. One that I enjoy a lot is the dots interval, which has that same summary statistics line at the bottom, but instead of doing a density smooth, it's making a histogram out of dots. And you can customize like how much data each dot corresponds to. This is the sort of default behavior, which I enjoy for getting a somewhat more nuanced look at the shape of the data than you get from a density smooth. Next slide. There's also an interval, which can be nice. This one's a little bit of a like funny representation of it, but you can imagine if you were showing something like a temperature value or the distributions of a parameter, showing the like highest and like most probable and less probable, or like most heavily represented or less heavily represented portions of a band can be useful. Next slide. And if you customize the color scales on them, they make a little bit more sense. So like that like looks more like a heat map to me than using the Virides color palette. Next slide. Another version of this that I've always enjoyed when you see like floating around is what's called a rain cloud plot, which combines multiple visualizations of the density distribution into one plot. And it's doing this, so we've got that slab interval that I showed before, which is the density smooth, and then underneath it, it's showing a lot more nuance in the like overall distribution of the data with these rain clouds. And it's doing that by, you see in the code, we have stat slab interval that gave us the mountains on top, and then the stat dots interval, and then side equals bottom gives us those rain clouds or raindrops coming down. So that can be great for if you want like an easy way to like visualize both the kind of gestalt of a density distribution and then a little bit more nuance than you get from the smooths. Next slide. And then if you're not showing just like, you know, those are all for histograms, which I think of as kind of one-dimensional. You can also plot ribbons around a line. You can also do it around a curve without having to like generate the like without having to do a lot of extra like code. So in base ggplot, if you were to want to plot a ribbon like this, so plotting those like bands of color around the line, you would need to calculate the like upper and lower bounds for each of those bands. And this one, you can just pass like the raw data, and then the line ribbon by the default can add these bands showing a 0.5, 0.8, and 0.95% interval around, in this case, I guess the mean or the median in each year. Next slide. You can modify like the widths of those bands, or like which quantiles essentially you're using. I don't know if quantile is quite the right word, but the quantiles that you're using around each one with the dot width argument. And this is a fun trick. Next slide. If you pass a whole bunch of points to the width argument using this p points function, you can get this effect that looks like a glowing gradient around the around your line, which is fun.
And it's
yeah, no, we can go on.
Also, I think, in addition to being fun, I think it is also I could be wrong, but I feel like I've seen some folks argue that this is a better way visually to represent uncertainty that is more like works with how our brains work better.
Oh,
not 100% sure about that.
Kind of like, I mean, I used to do this where like because the density of the line, or like the apparent density of the lines, becomes like more instead of having just like the homogeneous like everything from like,
yeah, we typically show 95% confidence intervals, but that's kind of arbitrary, right? The whole like that 0.5 cutoff is because Fisher thought it sounded like a nice number, right? And so,
Yeah.
yeah, this is like an alternative to deciding on any sort of cutoff, instead of just showing a gradient.
Yeah, you get to show the like actual heat map of it, sort of. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so this plays nicely with model outputs. So if you use two other packages, they're called Broom and Distributional. You can show the outputs, so like the parameter estimates from a frequentist, like a linear model, without too much extra work. Go on. So we can fit ourselves a little linear model of just like body mass by species, and then you can look at the parameter estimates using Broom to show us what the like estimated body size for the different species are. The intercept is for the Adelie penguins. And then next slide. We can pass this into the stat half I function from ggdist, which will plot those. It's like the stats. It is the stats interval by another name plot, where it looks, I guess, like half of an I with the density for the parameter estimate, and then the dot and lines to show the estimate and error bars. Next slide. Yeah, so you can also use the ribbons to show uncertainty around the lines of fit. So we can fit another linear model that's got a continuous predictor instead of the species-wise categorical ones, and a couple of different functions to get a predicted line of fit and then plot it. So next slide. So this is the code to fit ourselves a linear model with a continuous predictor. And this one has both the continuous predictor of year, and then we're continuing to break it out by species. And then we extract, we get fitted values from that model, and like standard error of the fit using tidyr, and then an augment function, which is from Broom. And then that gives us a data frame that has the year, and then a fitted value, and then a standard error. Next slide.
So this, just to confirm, this bit here is creating a data frame that goes into the new data argument. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
And then you can plot those ribbons, and here the stat line ribbon is taking this like y-dist because it's going to plot the line ribbons as like the quantiles of a distribution, in this case student t, given the information that you pass here, which is pretty cool. It's kind of magical. Yeah. And you could, I think you could probably pass like the p points thing here too to get yourself a little like continuous like gradient. The gradients remind me of like Microsoft Word, like, or like PowerPoint, the way you can have like the gradient fills, which I'm into. Like, of like the Microsoft early 2000s aesthetics, those were some of my favorites. And apparently it's good data communication. So highly recommended. And then lastly, the ggdist is really good for all the parts, basically, of a Bayesian model. And in fact, the ggdist package plays really nicely with tidyBayes. tidyBayes uses it. So if you're in the tidyBayes world, you're already using this a bunch. But because Bayesian models are just a pile of distributions in a trench coat, distributions on distributions, these are like efficient functions for plotting a whole bunch of distributions without having to create a whole bunch of like accessory data frames and filling up your workspace. So here's an example of just fitting a simple Bayesian linear model and then taking a look at some of the draws in the posterior. Next slide. So this is just, this is code to fit essentially the same linear model that we did with LM of regressing body mass against species. Only this time we're using BRMS to do it. Next slide. And then with the Bayesian model, we're going to extract draws from the posterior to get the like model's estimates of the intercepts or like body masses for the intercept, so the body mass for the Dealey penguins, and then the offsets for the other two species of penguins. And so that gives us a data frame with the different variables and then the values for all of the different draws from the posterior. And then we can pass that to a ggplot that has a geom dots interval to get and a stat slab interval. So these are the same rain cloud plots that I showed before. And it's showing, in this case, they're pretty nicely like symmetrical, the like density smooth and then samples from the posterior, because these are nice, happily behaved data coming from nice, pretty distributions out of the model. But it's a very fast way to visualize the posterior. So takeaways about ggdist, it has these geom and stat functions for plotting distributions. Those are similar. The geoms take already summarized data, and the stats take raw data, so you don't have to do any of the summarizing yourself. Slab functions, and there's a whole family of them, the dot interval and the half-eye, and there's more, show sort of variations on density plots, and ribbons show variation around the line. And it plugs in pretty easily to either a Bayesian or a frequentist modeling framework in R. So it can offload a lot of the additional in-between steps that you have to take between fitting a model and like visualizing the parameter estimates. Yeah, so it can save a little time and make some cool plots. Go on. And lastly, there is the ggraph package, not to be confused with ggiraffe, which does something different. Ggraph is for plotting graphs in the sense of like graph theory or networks, or more broadly, relational data. So we're trying to show the where the data is about the relationships between different entities. Next slide. So ggraph is for plotting networks, graphs, and trees. So that could be, you know, a host parasite network, social networks, dendrograms, network of like relationships, or a graph of relationships that has direction or not direction in a system. The sort of paradigm shift from ggplot is you have to add a layout to define how the network is set up. And so that would be something that would differentiate, like, I think they're called like hairball plots, where you just have like stuff and then lines connecting them, from say a tree that has a very specific structure to it. Like we have a very specific way that we represent a dendrogram because there's directionality and stuff to it. And then it adds geoms for the nodes and edges, or the, you know, in a classic plot, like the dots and then the lines that connect the dots. And it integrates with this package called tidygraph, which allows it to take in a lot of other object types that are produced by other packages for dealing with network or relational data in R. So you can pass it something from igraph or dendrogram or philo or age class. It can take in inputs from a whole bunch of other packages and work with them in a consistent framework, which is really nice. Next slide. And so the function for doing that is as table graph, I guess. It standardizes the different graph storage formats. Go on. So here, so I think there's a line of code that gets elided there. Can you go back for a second? There's a data frame on mouse social network interactions, which is, as I understand it, it's like which mice sniff each other in some experiment. I got this from a like compilation data set of like animal social networks, and I used to be a rodent researcher, or like I used to study like wild mice. So of course I went to the mice, and then of course I went to the one that was called mice sniffing. So I don't actually know what the scientific context is or the social implications of the mice sniffing each other is, except that there are social mice and mice communicate a lot. via sniffing each other. So anyway, these are which mice sniffed each other in like some group of mice, I presume. And it comes in this proprietary graph format. I think it's a graph ML file. And you can just pass that file into an as tipple graph, and that'll do something to make it into the type of object that ggraph wants. And then we can plot that, next slide, by using the ggraph function. So it's not ggplot, it's ggraph. And we pass it our like graph object, mouse graph, and then we have to specify a layout. And then we tell it what kind of edges, so that's the fan, and what kind of points or what kind of nodes we want it to have. And then we can title it mouse sniffs, because why would we not, given the opportunity? And so this will plot this is what I believe, I'm not a network scientist, but I believe people call this like a hairball plot, where you have a bunch of points and a bunch of lines connecting them. Interesting thing about this is if you plot this repeatedly, you will get very radically different looking plots, because it's a non-deterministic algorithm that determines exactly how these things are going to get laid out. Next slide. So you can specify alternative layouts that will also give you very different sort of overall appearances of the network. You could go to the documentation, or honestly, I think this is something where if you're going to be plotting a graph like this, a network like this, you probably would have somewhat more understanding of what the different layouts mean and how they're going to affect how your data get communicated. But you do need to be intentional about your choice. So go on, next slide. And this last one is a linear layout, and then it's like doing the systematic connecting of the points, so it gets close to being circular. And this could create something beautiful, I think. You know, it looks kind of like the fractal art that you see in some places. So
yeah, for sure. With like combining this with like using like coord equal to make the x and y axes equal, you'd get like a nice circle, like spirograph looking thing.
Yeah, spirographs. I had a
Uh-huh.
spirograph when I was a child.
Yeah.
They're fun. If you don't,
Yeah,
they're worth
yeah.
looking up. If you don't know what those are. Yeah. And the other major thing that I want to like include in this is that ggraph can plot phylogenetic trees. You can get a phylogenetic or phylogeny into R using a bunch of different methods. For this, you can snag one using this package, the ROTL, that connects to the R Open Tree of Life project. So next slide. Yeah, so for this, just because, again, I did used to study these creatures, we're going to grab a phylogeny for the heteromyid rodents, which are these like kangaroo rats. This is a kangaroo rat from about 3 hours southeast of Tucson, sitting on my foot. And so we're going to grab their phylogeny. They are extremely cute. And we can do that. This is the interface to the R Open Tree of Life, which I'm happy to chat about later if anyone wants to know. I'm not an expert, but basically we get ourselves a tree for the rodents that is of class Philo. Next slide. And then again, you can use the as table graph, or I'm not sure if that's what the TBL stands for and how to pronounce it, function to take that Philo object and turn it into a graph that we can pass to ggraph. Next slide. And then ggraph can use a layout called dendrogram to plot the rodent graph as a dendrogram. Next slide. Or as you know, for a lot of phylogenies that are not rooted, you could also plot it as an unrooted phylogeny with an unrooted layout.
That definitely looks like some abstract art right there.
I know. I feel like, yeah, you could probably get some pretty weird stuff. Yeah, so takeaways, the ggraph is like one package that you can use to plot a lot of different types of like network objects. You can funnel these different types, shaped things into as table graph, and then ggraph can handle it. And that I think the biggest sort of biggest point of sort of like scientific degrees of freedom here, as far as the visualization goes, comes down to that layout and the way in which selecting different layouts or selecting a deterministic or an undeterministic layout can really change the appearance of a graph, and also, again, the sort of way the graph, what the graph communicates or what stands out from the graph. Next slide. So I think that's about those are the samples that we had to share. We do have slides for resources because this is really just like skimming the surface of each of these packages. So there's resources at each of these packages, like documentation sites, so Patchwork, ggAnimate. And then if you go to these slides online or go to the next slide, we've got links to ggdist, and then packages for ggraph, and if you're interested, our Open Tree of Life. Our group is also available to work on, to help you work through stuff like this through our drop-in hours, which happen from 9 to 10 on Tuesdays virtually. We're also active, and there's a community on the UA Data Science Slack page. And beyond that, next slide. Yeah, beyond that, we have a chunk of time now to talk to you all about, we're curious if there are extensions that you use, or if there are more questions that you have about your work or about any of these packages that are inspired by what we just ran through today, or maybe something that you've been looking for in this workshop that we can help you explore. We would love to do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Renata, for that excellent wrap up. And yeah, we will hang out for a bit to see if any folks have questions. But if not, that's the end. And just thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see so many repeat people in all three parts of the workshop too. So hopefully that is a sign, I think, that you all found it valuable. And we will have all the recordings for all of these available as well. So on our YouTube channel. So if you did miss the earlier parts, if part 3 is the first one you've attended and you want to go back and watch parts 1 and 2, those will be available as well as the slides and notes and things are going to be available. And maybe we'll, Kristina, you put that link to the course website one more time in the chat for folks. That'll be where you can go to get all this stuff. The recording, obviously, for this isn't up there yet, but it will be. So yeah, thank you all. And yeah, we're happy to field any questions about ggplot2 or extensions or anything.